There is a particular sound that a fence post makes when it finally accepts the ground. Not the crack of impact, not the thud of the mallet. Something quieter than both of those, a settling, a giving way, the moment when the earth decides it will hold the thing you are driving into it. Grove Danner had heard that sound several thousand times in the 9 years he had worked this land, and he still listened for it every time because it was the only way to know for certain that the work had taken. He was at the north fence at 6 in the morning when the April light was still thin and gray over the Bitterroot ridgeline. His breath came out in small clouds. The ground was soft from snowmelt, which was good for driving posts and hard for everything else, and he moved along the line with the efficiency of a man who had done this particular work so many times that his body knew the sequence without consulting his mind. Set the post, drive it plumb. Check the lean with his eye, not a level, because after 9 years his eye was better than any level he owned. Listen for the settling, move to the next. He was a large man, not in the way that some large men are large, all noise and displacement filling a room before they have said a word. Grove Danner's size was the quiet kind, the kind that you noticed slowly and then could not stop noticing. 6 feet and 3 inches in his work boots, wide through the chest and shoulders, in a way that spoke of decades of actual labor rather than any particular effort toward it. His beard was a dark reddish-brown, shot through with the first threads of gray, at 36 trimmed, short enough to be practical, long enough that the cold did not find his jaw. His hands were the hands of a man who had made something from nothing, scarred across the knuckles, calloused in the specific places that told you exactly what kind of work he did, and how much of it he did, and how long he had been doing it. He had been on this land 9 years. He had come with $400 a mule and a box of his father's tools, and he had built everything on Danner Fork from the ground up: the cabin, the barn, the calf pens, the 2 miles of fence that marked the boundary of what was his. He had done most of it alone. The parts he had not done alone he had done with Clara in the first year before she understood what alone would truly mean out here when the winter came down from the mountains and the nearest neighbor was 2 miles of frozen road away. And the silence was not the peaceful kind, but the pressing kind. The kind that gets into the walls of a place, no matter how well you have built them. Clara had been gone 4 years. He did not think about Clara while he worked. He had learned over 4 years how to arrange his thinking so that it moved around her absence, the way water moves around a stone, following the path of least resistance, finding other channels. He was good at this now. He was less good at it in the evenings when the work stopped, and there was nothing left to arrange his thinking around except the sound of one person in a cabin built with the assumption of 2. He set the last post of the morning run at 7:40, listened for the settling, heard it, and picked up his tools. The ridge to the west had gone from gray to gold. He had 4 hours before the ground would dry enough to be difficult, and he needed to cover the east section before then. He loaded the mallet and the post pounder into the wheelbarrow and started back toward the barn. He saw Maggie Trust's wagon on the road before he was halfway across the yard. Maggie Trust was 63 years old, had run the post office and general store in Harrow Valley for 31 years, and had developed over those 31 years a comprehensive knowledge of every person within 20 miles that she maintained with the diligence of a scholar and the discretion of a woman who understood exactly how much she knew and exactly how carefully she needed to be about what she did with that knowledge. She was not a gossip. That was the important distinction. A gossip shared information for the pleasure of sharing it. Maggie shared information when she had decided it needed to move from where it was to somewhere it could do more good, and she made that determination thoughtfully and usually correctly. She pulled up at the gate and called to him from the wagon seat. Grove set down the wheelbarrow and walked to the gate. "You have mail," Maggie said. She was holding an envelope. "I can get mail on my supply day. This one I thought you should have today." He looked at the envelope. His name on the front, care of the Harrow Valley Post Office, in handwriting he did not recognize. The return address was a printed one, a publication in Omaha, Nebraska, that he had seen before because Maggie had placed the Matrimonial Gazette on her counter beside the seed catalogs and the almanacs 3 winters ago, and he had picked it up, once read the first page, set it back down. Then she had put a form on the counter 6 months later, and he had filled it in. He was not entirely sure how that had happened. He remembered standing at the counter waiting for his account to be tallied and looking at the form and picking up the pencil. He remembered Maggie saying nothing while he wrote, which was unusual for Maggie, and he had taken the form's questions one at a time: age, occupation, acreage, nearest town, what he was seeking. That last question he had stared at for a long time. He had written finally, someone who intends to stay. It had not seemed like enough, and he had been right about that because Maggie had waited until he was not looking and written more. He did not find out until later what more she had written. "How many responses?" he asked. "One," Maggie said. He took the envelope. He did not open it at the gate. He went back to the barn and sat down on an overturned bucket in the tack room, which was the most private place on the property, and he looked at the envelope for a while before he opened it. One response. He had mailed the form in October, and it was now the second week of April, and there had been one response, which meant that the better part of 6 months had passed, and one person out of everyone who had read whatever Maggie had written had decided to write back, and he was holding that person's letter, and he was not entirely sure he was ready to read it. He opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages written front and back in a hand that was clear and practical without being elegant, the hand of someone who had learned to write for utility rather than display. He read it straight through without stopping. Her name was Beatrice Farrow. She went by Bet. She was 31 years old, from Kearney County, Nebraska, the daughter of a cattle rancher whose operation had been solid for 20 years, and then in the space of 3 bad seasons and 1 devastating winter had ceased to be solid in the way that things on the frontier ceased to be solid, which was to say, all at once and without adequate warning. Her father had died 2 years ago. She had 2 brothers, both of whom had gone to work other men's land rather than rebuild the families. She was 5 feet 11 inches tall. She mentioned this plainly in the second paragraph, not apologetically, and not as a challenge, but as information, the way you would mention the weather in a place someone was considering visiting. She said she was broader through the shoulders than most women she knew, and that her hands were not the kind of hands that were going to improve with age, meaning they were already the hands of someone who had done more physical work than most men twice her age, and that this was simply what they were, and she had no particular feelings about it either way. She did not know how to embroider. She could cook well enough that no one was going to go hungry. She could read, which she mentioned not as a point of pride, but because she wanted to read in the evenings, and she wanted whoever was reading this to know that about her before they decided anything. She had specific opinions about cattle and general opinions about most other things, and she was willing to work as hard as the land required, which she understood, having grown up on one, was harder than most people who had not grown up on one could imagine. Then she asked a question. She asked it at the bottom of the 3rd page, and it was, did he think of this arrangement as a long-term proposition, or did he need someone to help him get through the winter and hoped things would clarify themselves in the spring? Grove read that question 3 times. He sat in the tack room for a while after he finished the letter. Outside, a meadowlark was working the fence line, doing what meadowlarks did in April, announcing itself to everything within a quarter mile. The barn smelled of hay and horse and the particular mineral quality of cold ground slowly warming. He went back to Maggie's wagon. She was still at the gate, which he had suspected she would be. "What did you write?" he said. "In the form, the part you added." Maggie reached into her coat and produced a folded piece of paper, which she handed to him. A copy, because Maggie kept copies of things, another habit born of 31 years of understanding that information was only as useful as your ability to produce it at the relevant moment. He unfolded it and read what she had written to describe him. She had written non-drinker, no debts, 450 acres good water sound structures north of Harrow Valley, Montana territory. Owner is 36, has worked this land alone for 9 years. Quiet man, but not a difficult one. Speaks when he has something to say. Has not found a way to say this particular thing himself, which is that he is looking for someone who means to stay. Not someone passing through. Not someone who will find the winter too long or the silence too deep. Someone who looks at a piece of ground that has been worked hard and honestly and sees a life in it rather than an obstacle to one. Grove folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "You wrote more than I said," he told her. "I wrote what you meant," she said. "There's a difference." He went inside and found paper and a pen, and he wrote back that afternoon. He wrote 3 drafts. The first 2 were too careful and too short, and both of them failed to answer her question, which was the only question that mattered. The 3rd draft answered the question first before anything else, and then explained himself as best he could in language that was plain and honest and not particularly elegant, because elegant was not a thing he was capable of, and he had decided, sitting at that kitchen table with the 2 failed drafts beside him, that he was not going to try to be. He wrote, "This is a long-term proposition. That is the only kind I am interested in." He wrote about the land, how it sat in the valley, what the winters were like, how long they lasted, what the work looked like month by month from April to November, and what November through March looked like after that. He wrote about the nearest neighbor and the town 4 miles east, and the church he went to on Sundays, more because his father had gone to church than because he had a particularly active relationship with the theology involved. He wrote that he was not a man who talked much, but that he was a man who meant what he said, and he had found those 2 qualities went together often enough that he had stopped apologizing for the first one. He did not write about Clara. He sealed the envelope, rode to Maggie's store, and mailed it before he had a chance to reconsider. That was in April. In May, he received a second letter from Bet Faro, shorter than the first, asking 3 specific questions about the land, and one less specific question that she had put at the very end, almost as an afterthought, which was, "Do you think a person can make a place their home if they did not grow up in it, or does home have to be somewhere you remember?" He wrote back. She wrote back. This went on through May and into June, the letters arriving and departing through Maggie's counter, a conversation conducted over distances and weeks in the particular way that frontier people conducted the most important conversations of their lives, with time between each exchange that forced a certain quality of deliberateness onto every word, because you could not take a word back once it was in the envelope and the envelope was in the mail. By July, he knew the shape of her thinking, which was direct and unsentimental and occasionally surprising in ways that made him read a passage twice. He knew she read history when she could find it, and that she preferred practical books to novels, and that she had once in a sentence, she seemed to have almost immediately regretted, including mention that she had been told her whole life that a woman her size ought to make herself smaller in the ways that she could not control physically, meaning quieter, meaning less, certain meaning less, and that she had tried this for about 6 months when she was 22 and had found it to be unsustainable and had subsequently stopped. He wrote back about that. He was not an eloquent man, but he was a precise one, and what he wrote was that he had not put in the form that he was looking for someone smaller, and that he did not understand why she would think that would be what he wanted. He was a large man. Large men were not, in his experience, well served by people who made themselves small around them. He did not know, writing that, whether it was the right thing to say. He only knew it was true. In August, she wrote and said she would come in the fall if he still wanted that. He wrote back, "Still want it." She arrived on the 2nd Thursday of October. Grove was not at the station. He had been at the station in his mind, planned to be at the station, had thought about being at the station for the better part of 3 weeks. And then the east fence had taken damage from 2 nights of hard rain, and he had gone out at 4 in the morning to assess it and found that the assessment required immediate action, or he was going to lose a section of fence and the 4 cattle that grazed near it, and when he finally had it patched well enough to leave it, the sun was past noon and Maggie's wagon had already gone and come back. He was still working the fence when he heard the wagon. He looked up. Maggie was on the seat, and next to Maggie, or rather occupying a different quality of space on the seat next to Maggie, was a woman that Grove looked at for the first time and then had to adjust the way he was looking, the way you adjust your eyes when the light changes, because the picture required more room than he had initially allocated for it. She was taller than he had imagined, which was not something he had expected to think because he was 6 feet 3 inches, and he had not imagined needing to make that adjustment for a woman. She was not taller than him, but she was closer to his height than any woman he had ever spoken to, and her shoulders were wide under the practical gray wool of her coat, and she was sitting on Maggie's wagon seat, the way someone sits who has sat on the back of horses and the hard seats of working wagons for most of her life, which is to say, with a stillness that was not stiffness, but something more considered than that. He put down the fence tool and walked to the gate. She had already climbed down from the wagon by the time he got there. She had 2 bags. She had picked up both of them herself without waiting to be offered assistance, which he registered without particularly thinking about it. She set them down at her feet and looked at him. Her face was not what he had pictured, which he understood immediately was because he had pictured something from a catalog and she was an actual person. And the difference between a catalog and an actual person was the difference between a description of ground and ground itself. She had dark brown eyes that were taking in a great deal. Very quickly, her gaze moving over him and then past him to the fence line and the barn and the slope of the pasture and back to him. And she had the particular steadiness in her expression of someone who had made a decision and was now in the process of confirming that the decision had been made on accurate information. "You're Grove Danner," she said. "I am." She looked at the fence section behind him. "You were working the east line. Rain damage, 2 nights ago." She nodded the nod of someone who knew what rain damage to a fence line looked like and what 2 nights of rain in October in Montana would do to soil that was already soft. She picked up her bags again, both of them, and walked through the gate. "Which way is the barn?" she said. He pointed. "I'll put my bags inside and come back and help you finish." He almost said she didn't need to, and then he didn't say it because she clearly knew she didn't need to, and the statement would have been about something other than the fence, and he did not want to start this with a statement that was about something other than what it claimed to be. She walked toward the house. She had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. It was built for Grove, who was 6'3", but she cleared it by less than he did, and something about the automatic nature of the gesture, the practiced quality of it, told him that she had been ducking through spaces her whole life without giving it a second thought. He watched her go inside, stood at the gate for a moment, and then went back to the fence. She came out 11 minutes later in different clothes, work trousers, and a canvas shirt with the sleeves already rolled, and she came straight to the fence without asking what needed doing, because she could see what needed doing, and for the next hour and 20 minutes they worked the east section together. Grove driving posts and Bet stringing wire with a knowledge of the work that required no instruction, and they did not speak except to say practical things about the fence itself, and the fence got done in less than half the time it would have taken him alone. That evening he made supper, salt pork and biscuits and the last of the summer's dried beans, which was plain food but solid food, and Bet ate it without comment and without performance the way a person eats who has been working since noon and is hungry. "You grind your own meal," she said, looking at the biscuits. "My father's stone mill. He brought it from Ohio." She nodded. "Nebraska stone mills cut finer. Yours is coarser." "I know. I've thought about getting a finer one." "The coarser grind makes a better biscuit," she said. "Holds together under gravy." He looked at the biscuit on his plate and then at her and said nothing. She went back to eating. After supper, she washed the dishes without being asked, because they were in front of her and needed washing, and he dried them, and they moved in the small kitchen with the particular care of 2 people who did not yet know each other's dimensions and were being cautious about the space between them. It was not awkward. It was simply precise. Later, he sat at the table, and she sat across from him, and they drank the last of the evening's coffee, and he thought about the many things he might say, and said none of them, and then she said, "The east fence has 1 post that wants to lean in the spring when the ground goes soft again. The 3rd from the gate. You'll want to pack additional stone around the base before the hard freeze." "I know the one," he said. "I thought you might." She set her cup down. "I'm going to turn in. Early start tomorrow if you want to show me the rest of the property." "I'll be up at 5. "I'll be up at 4:30, she said, not as a correction but as information, and she went to her room. Grove sat at the table for a while after she was gone. The cabin was quiet in the way it had been quiet for 4 years, but the quality of the quiet was different in a way he could not have named precisely, in a way that had something to do with a pair of work boots he had heard being set down on the floor of the back room. He sat with his coffee until it was cold. Then he noticed on the kitchen table near where Bet had been sitting a small envelope sealed, addressed in her handwriting to someone in Kearney County, Nebraska. He looked at it for a long time. He did not pick it up. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the cabin, which were his sounds. The creak of the roof, timber, the particular voice of the wind through the gap above the north window that he had been meaning to caulk for 2 years, the faint pop of the fire settling. And underneath those sounds across the cabin wall, the presence of another person, a stillness that was not his own. He looked up at the ceiling. He thought about the letter she had written him in July, the one that had mentioned what she'd been told her whole life about making herself smaller. He had thought about that letter many times since he'd received it, in the same way you think about something true that you had not thought of in exactly that way before. He thought about the envelope on the kitchen table addressed to Kearney County, Nebraska. He thought, "She has been here 10 hours. He thought, "I do not know what that envelope contains." He thought, "I am not going to ask her." And then he thought about the question she had asked in her very first letter, the one that had made him read it 3 times before he continued. "Do you think of this as a long-term proposition, or do you need someone to get through the winter?" He had answered that question plainly, and he had meant the answer. He was not entirely sure she had answered it at all. He lay in the dark thinking about this until he heard what he had not heard in 4 years. Another person turning over in a bed in the room on the other side of the wall, a small, ordinary sound. And then the cabin was still again, and after a while Grove Danner closed his eyes. The first morning she was up before he was. He came out of his room at 4:45 and she was already at the stove, not cooking yet, but assessing the stove in the way she would assess most things. He would come to learn with a quick, comprehensive attention that moved from the firebox to the grate to the pipe and back, reading the object as a text that contained information she needed. She had found the coffee without being shown where it was, because it was where coffee was always kept in a working kitchen, and she had simply looked there first. "Damper's sticking," she said without turning around. "Left side. Has to be lifted slightly before it'll turn. I'll look at it today." "You don't have to. Sticking damper wastes fuel," she said, which was not an argument so much as a statement of what was true, and she handed him a cup of coffee and went back to looking at the stove. He drank the coffee and said nothing, and outside the October dark sat on the valley, and the stars were still clear over the western ridge, and the day had not yet decided what it was going to be. They went out after first light, and he showed her the property. She walked it with the attention of an engineer and the eye of someone who had grown up reading land as a language, asking questions that were specific and practical. Where did the runoff go? In heavy spring melt. How deep was the well? What was the carrying capacity of the north pasture in a dry year? Had he had any trouble with the creek flooding the lower calf pen? He answered each question as precisely as he could, which was very precisely because he had been asking himself these questions for 9 years and had good answers to most of them. At the north fence, she stopped and looked west toward the Bitterroot Ridge line. "Good timber up there," she said. "Not mine." "Whose?" "The man who owns the Bitterroot parcel hasn't been out here in 3 years. Name's Cornelius Pacht. He lives in town, runs the bank." She looked at the ridge line a moment longer. "Has he ever approached you about your land?" Grove was quiet for half a step. "Once or twice." She did not press further. She was already looking at the fence line, running her eye along it with a quality of attention that reminded him oddly of the way experienced horses looked at terrain, not at individual features, but at the whole of it, integrating the information. The second morning, 3 days after she arrived, the bull got out. His name was Garrison, and he weighed close to 1,800 pounds, and he had the temperament of a man who had decided that most rules did not apply to him and the physical size to make that position difficult to argue with. He had found the gap in the south pen fence that Grove had been meaning to address since September, and he had made the gap considerably wider in the process of finding it, and by 5:30 in the morning he was standing in the yard looking pleased with himself. Grove came out and saw the situation. He got a lead rope from the barn and approached from the front, which he knew was not ideal, but which was the angle available to him given where Garrison was standing in the yard. The bull looked at him with the flat, unconcerned gaze of an animal who has already done the arithmetic and knows how it comes out. Garrison lowered his head, not charging yet, but considering it. Grove stopped. He heard Bet come out of the cabin behind him, heard her boots on the porch, and he said without turning, "Stay back." She did not stay back. He heard her moving not toward him, but at an angle circling wide toward the bull's left flank, and he wanted to say stop again and did not, because something in the quality of how she was moving, a particular deliberateness that was entirely different from the momentum of someone making a mistake, made him hold the word in his mouth and wait. She came around to Garrison's left side from a distance of about 15 feet, moving with the slow, unhurried quality of water finding its level. She was not sneaking. She was simply moving at a speed that did not register as a threat, and she was talking low and continuous, not words he could make out from where he stood, but sound made into language, rhythmic, and even the voice of someone who understood that what they were doing was not about dominance but about information, about offering the animal something other than the adrenaline it was currently sorting through. Garrison's ear moved, the right ear rotating toward her. His head came up slightly from its lowered position. She kept moving, kept talking, and when she was 8 feet away she stopped and stood still for 30 seconds, and in those 30 seconds something changed in the set of the bull's neck. Some decision being made at a level below conscious thought, and then she took the last steps and placed her hand flat against his flank, just behind the shoulder, and kept it there, and the sound that came out of Garrison then was not a sound Grove had ever heard from him before, a long, slow exhalation, the release of something that had been held. The bull's head dropped. Bet moved her hand in slow circles. She kept talking. She walked him in a long, slow arc back toward the barn, and he followed her with the docility of an animal that has decided for reasons of its own that this is what it wants to do. Grove followed at a distance. At the barn door she looked back at him. "Lead rope," she said. He handed it to her. She made a halter of it with movements that were too fluid to be improvised experience made automatic, and she walked Garrison into his pen and latched it behind her. She looked at the gap in the pen fence. The measurement in her eyes was the same one she had used on the bull, quick and complete. "I'll fix this before noon," she said. She said it the way she said most things, as a statement of what was going to happen rather than a request for permission. She went to get tools from the barn. Grove stood at the pen fence and watched her go. He thought about what he had written in that letter in July about not being well served by people who made themselves small. He thought about what small even meant applied to a woman who had just walked up to 1,800 pounds of agitated animal and put her hand on it. He went to get his own tools. They fixed the fence together without discussing whose job it was, because it was in front of both of them and needed doing, and that was sufficient reason for two people who thought about work the same way. Over the days that followed, a pattern established itself. Not because either of them designed it, but because two people in proximity to a piece of working land with an honest amount of work to be done will naturally find the shape of the work together, if they are both the kind of person who does not need to be told what needs doing and does not need to be thanked for doing it. On the fourth morning he found that she had oiled the damper on the stove before he was up so that it turned smoothly for the first time in 2 years, and she said nothing about it when he came to the stove and found it working correctly. On the fifth morning he replaced the broken handle on the water bucket that she had been using without complaint since she arrived, and set the bucket by the well without comment, and found it gone when he came back at noon, which meant she had taken it without comment either. On the sixth morning she sharpened every blade in the kitchen, which he noticed because a sharp knife is different in the hand from a dull one in a way that is immediately apparent, and he filed this away along with the oiled damper and the bucket handle as part of something he was assembling slowly. On the seventh evening it rained. Not the hard rain of a storm, but the steady, persistent rain of early autumn in the mountains, the kind that was going to go on until it decided to stop, and that made no promises about when that would be. He was on the porch when it started, and she came out 20 minutes later and stood at the rail looking at it. "In Nebraska," she said, "rain like this means the creek's going to run high by morning. Here it means the ground will be soft enough to work by noon." She looked at him. It was the first time she had looked at him in the week she had been here in a way that was not assessing the situation or gathering information about the property or figuring out what needed to be done next. It was the first time she had looked at him simply as a thing that was interesting to look at. "You see rain differently here," she said. "You see everything differently when you've been in a place long enough." She turned back to the rain. They stood at the rail while the evening came down over the valley, and the rain continued its patient work on the fields, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and it was not a silence that needed to be filled. When she finally went inside, he stood on the porch alone for another few minutes, listening to the rain, and he thought about the envelope he had seen on the kitchen table on the first night. He had not seen another one since. He did not know if that meant she had not written another, or if she had simply become more careful about where she left them. He did not know, and he did not ask, and he told himself this was because he had decided not to intrude on whatever it was, and not because he was afraid of the answer, and he was not entirely sure that was true. The seventh morning was a Sunday. He went to church in Harrow Valley as he always did, as much because it was the habit of 9 years as because he had any particular need to be in a church. He expected her to stay at the property. She came with him. She sat beside him in the fourth pew and sang the hymns in a voice that was lower than the women around her and clearer than most of the men, and she shook hands afterward with Reverend Albright and with the people who came to introduce themselves, and he watched her do this with the attention he had been paying to everything she did in the 7 days since she arrived. She was not warm exactly. She was not the kind of person who put warmth on like a garment when it was required. She was direct. She looked at people when they spoke to her, and she answered their questions with precision, and she asked her own questions in return, and the people who found this comfortable would remember her positively, and the people who found it uncomfortable would find it uncomfortable, and she seemed equally prepared for both outcomes. Cornelius Pacht was there. He was a man of 55, with the kind of face that was designed to put people at ease, soft around the eyes, easy to smile, the face of a man who understood the social value of being well-liked. He ran the bank and owned the largest property in the area, 3,000 acres on the Bitterroot side, and he wore the authority of that the way a well-made coat hangs on a man naturally without apparent effort. He had come to Harrow Valley before Grove had, and he had the kind of established presence that came with having been somewhere first. He came to them after the service. He introduced himself to Bet with the practiced ease of a man for whom introductions were a professional skill. Shook her hand, held it perhaps a half-second longer than necessary, said he was pleased she had come to the valley, that it was a fine piece of land Grove had built up, that she was welcome to call on him or his wife Ruth if she found herself in need of anything in those first settling in weeks when a new place had more questions than it had answers. Bet said that was kind of him. Pacht talked with Grove for a few minutes about the coming winter, about the price of hay, about a road repair the county had been promising for 3 years that had not yet materialized. He was pleasant throughout. He shook Grove's hand and tipped his hat to Bet and walked back to where his wife and his son Owen were waiting at the church steps. Grove watched him go. "He came to church to look at me," Bet said quietly beside him. It was not a question. "He knows everything that happens in this valley," Grove said. "You are the most significant thing that has happened here in some time." "That's not what I meant." Grove looked at her. She was still watching Pacht. "He came to see what had changed," she said. "Not just that you had a wife, something else." Grove said nothing. She turned and looked at him. "You and he have a history. Our families do, from before I came here." She waited. "His business and my father's had a difficulty," Grove said, 20 years ago, before either of us came to Montana. My father made a decision that affected him badly. He's never been satisfied with how it was resolved." "And your father?" "My father died 4 years ago, in Ohio. He never came west." Grove turned toward the wagon. "I have his tools and his stone mill and the $400 he left me, which is what I used to buy this land." Bet walked beside him toward the wagon. She did not ask more, but he could see in the corner of his vision that she was thinking the particular quality of stillness that came over her when she was arranging information into a shape she could use. He helped her up to the wagon seat, which she accepted without the kind of protest that would have been performance, and they rode back to the property in the thin October sunshine, and he thought about the look on Pacht's face when he had first seen Bet. Not surprised, not impressed exactly. Something more like recalibration, the expression of a man who has been holding a picture of a situation in his mind and has encountered a detail that requires him to redraw it. He thought about that look for the rest of the day while he worked, while he ate supper, while he sat at the table after supper with his hands around a cup of coffee. The cabin was quiet. Bet was in her room. He could hear her moving the particular sounds of a person settling into a space for the evening, and underneath those sounds he heard something else. The specific quiet of a person who has stopped moving. Writing, he thought. She was writing. He looked at the kitchen table. No envelope there tonight. She had gotten careful. He turned his cup in his hands and thought about the first letter she had ever sent him, that letter in April, with her name and her plainness and her question. He thought about how he had answered the question and what he had meant by the answer. He thought about a person being careful about where they left their envelopes in a house that they had been in for 7 days, and what kinds of things made a person careful in exactly that way. Outside, the October night settled over Harrow Valley. The creek talked to itself beyond the tree line. Somewhere to the north, up near the Bitterroot timber, a coyote said something brief and definitive about the evening. Grove sat at the table and listened and thought and did not yet know what he was listening for. In the morning he was up at 4:30. She was already at the stove. He noticed this. He noticed specifically that the sound of her moving in the kitchen was a sound he had been listening for without knowing he was listening for it, and that when he heard it, he had felt something settle in the way that a fence post settles when the ground decides to hold it. He also noticed that morning a second thing. Beside the door on the hook where she hung her coat, there was an envelope tucked into the coat pocket. Just the corner of it was visible. The address on the front said Kearney County, Nebraska, a different hand than the one on the first envelope he had seen. Someone writing to her, not a letter she was sending out. Someone in Nebraska had written to Bet Farrow in the second week of October, and the letter had arrived through Maggie's counter, and she had put it in her coat pocket, and she had not mentioned it. Grove poured his coffee. He sat down at the table. She set a plate in front of him without being asked, and sat across from him with her own plate, and they ate in the practical silence that they had developed over 7 mornings, the silence of 2 people who had established a rhythm together and did not require conversation to maintain it. He looked at her across the table. She was eating with the straightforward focus of someone who has work to do after breakfast and needs fuel before she can do it. She was, he thought, exactly what she had told him she was in that first letter. She had not misrepresented a single thing, which made the letter in her coat pocket something he needed to understand. Not because he did not trust her. He had been watching her for 7 days, and his reading of people, developed over 36 years of living in places where reading people correctly was often a matter of survival, told him that she was honest. Not in the careful way of someone managing their honesty, but in the structural way of someone who found dishonesty more trouble than it was worth. But honest people could have things they were not yet ready to say, and something or someone in Kearney County, Nebraska was writing to her. He did not ask. She finished eating, washed her plate, and said she was going to check the north fence line for winter readiness, and did he want her to start at the gate or at the creek crossing? Creek crossing, he said. The ground's softer there, and you'll want to assess the posts while the earth's still got some give. She nodded and went out. He sat at the table for another few minutes with his coffee going cold in his hands. He thought about what Pacht had looked like at church, the recalibration, the redrawing of a picture. He thought about 20 years of history between their families. History he only knew the edges of the part that had happened before he was old enough to understand what was happening. He thought about a man who ran the valley's only bank and owned 3,000 acres and had twice in the 9 years Grove had been here made an offer on Danner Fork that Grove had declined, and who had received each of those declines with the patience of a man who understood that patience was a longer game than pressure. He thought about all of this, and about the letter in Bet's coat pocket, and about 7 mornings that had been in every practical sense exactly what he had hoped they would be. He thought, there are things she has not told me. He thought, there are things I have not told her. He thought, the question is whether those things, when they come to light, change what these 7 mornings have been. He went outside to work. She was already at the creek crossing checking posts, moving along the line with the same quality of competent, unhurried attention she brought to everything on this property, and he watched her from across the field for a moment before she saw him. She was, he thought, exactly as large as she had said she was, and exactly as capable as she had said she was, and exactly as direct as she had said she was. And he did not know why she was in Montana. Not the reason she had written in the letters, which was the reason he had answered her letters and sent her the form and stood at the gate in October waiting for Maggie's wagon, that practical, honest reason about wanting a life that was actually a life and not just a series of seasons endured. He did not know the reason underneath that reason. He thought that he was going to find out, and sooner than he expected. He picked up his tools and walked out to the fence. There is a kind of knowledge that arrives before you have the words for it. Not intuition exactly, not the vague feeling that something is wrong. Something more specific than that, more like the way a farmer reads the sky before a storm, not the storm itself, but the particular quality of light that precedes it, the pressure in the air, the way sound carries differently when the weather is building. Grove Danner had spent 9 years reading land and weather and the behavior of animals in a place that punished inattention, and he had developed as a consequence a capacity for that kind of pre-knowledge that he did not think of as a gift so much as a tool, something he had built through repetition the way he had built every other tool he owned. He did not think of it as a gift, but he trusted it. And in the second week after Bet Faro arrived at Danner Fork, something in the weather of the situation began to change. He could not have said what it was exactly. Bet herself was the same. She rose before he did and worked alongside him through the daylight hours and ate supper without ceremony and asked practical questions about the property and did not ask impractical ones about him. She was learning the land the way a serious person learns a language systematically, starting with the most necessary vocabulary and building outward from there. She knew where the water ran soft in a wet year and where the ground was solid enough to take heavy equipment, and which of the 4 fence lines was going to need the most attention before the hard freeze came. She knew the names of his 3 horses and the particular habits of each, and she had already established a working relationship with Garrison the bull that Grove found quietly remarkable because he had spent 2 years managing Garrison by knowing exactly where to stand and how to move and what not to do. And Bet had arrived at the same knowledge in 11 days by a route he could not entirely follow. All of that was the same. What was different was something in the periphery. The letter in her coat pocket that he had seen and not asked about. The way she sometimes paused in whatever she was doing and looked south toward the road with an expression that was gone before he could read it properly. Small things. The kind of things that would not have registered at all if he had not been by nature and by necessity the kind of man who registered small things. On the 14th morning he rode into Harrow Valley for supplies. Maggie Trust's store occupied the southeast corner of the main street, a long, low building that smelled of coffee and sawdust and the particular combination of goods that frontier stores accumulated over decades: leather and flour and lamp oil and printed cotton and the backnotes of things that had been stored and moved and stored again. Maggie ran it with the efficiency of a person who understood that efficiency was a form of respect for other people's time. She was behind the counter when he came in working through a delivery manifest with the pencil she kept behind her ear. She looked up when the door opened. Grove. Morning, Maggie. He gave her his list. She began pulling items from the shelves with the unhurried speed of long practice. He stood at the counter and waited. How is she settling? Maggie said, not looking up from the shelves. She's capable. I know she's capable. I read her letter before I forwarded it. Maggie set a sack of flour on the counter. How is she settling? Grove considered the question as a different question from the one he had answered. She's learning the land fast. She doesn't waste motion. She's not complaining about the cold, and it's been cold. That's still capability. Maggie turned and looked at him directly. I mean, is she settling in the way of a person who intends to stay? He looked at her for a moment. Why do you ask it that way? Maggie was quiet for long enough that the quiet itself was an answer of a kind. She turned back to the shelves and pulled down a tin of coffee, set it on the counter. Then she said without drama, without preamble, because I received a letter 3 days ago addressed to Beatrice Faro, care of this post office. Return address was Kearney County, Nebraska, a law office. The store was quiet. Outside, someone rode past on the street, and the sound of the horse's feet on the cold dirt came through the wall and passed, and was gone. Did she come in for it? Grove said. Yesterday. She did not open it here. Grove looked at the tin of coffee on the counter. He thought about the envelope he had seen in her coat pocket on the 8th morning. He thought about the pause in her expression when she looked south toward the road. He thought about a law office in Kearney County, Nebraska, and a woman who had written him letters through the summer that were honest in every particular, and who had still, he was increasingly certain, not yet told him the most important particular. Is there anything else? He said. Maggie looked at him steadily. There is one more thing, and I tell you this not as gossip and not as interference. I tell you this because you are someone I have watched work hard for 9 years on honest land, and you deserve to have the information. He waited. Neil Pact was in here 4 days ago, Maggie said. He was asking about the property, about whether you had mentioned any plans to expand, about whether the arrival of a wife changed your intentions regarding the land. She paused. He was also asking in the way that Pact asks things when he does not want to appear to be asking them whether you had looked recently at your father's old business arrangements, whether there was anything outstanding. The words landed in the particular way that true words land when they confirm something you have been sensing at the edge of your awareness for long enough that the confirmation feels less like surprise than like recognition. "He mentioned my father's arrangements," Grove said. "He was careful about it. He was, as he always is, perfectly pleasant. But yes." Maggie held his gaze. "He mentioned your father." Grove paid for his supplies and loaded them into the wagon and drove back to Danner Fork and for the 4 miles of road between town and his property. He thought about Cornelius Pacht and what Grove knew of the history between their families, which was less than he should have known, because his father had been the kind of man who believed that carrying a grievance forward into the next generation was a form of cruelty to the next generation, and had therefore not told Grove the full shape of what had happened between him and Pacht in 1867. What Grove knew was the outline. The two men had been in business together briefly, a freighting proposition that had gone badly. His father had withdrawn from the arrangement before it collapsed. Pacht had not. The collapse had cost Pacht considerably. The two men had not spoken again after that, and when Grove's father had died in Ohio 4 years ago, the only mention of Pacht in his papers had been an old letter never sent that said, "I know you believe I wronged you. I did not wrong you intentionally. I would have explained myself if you had asked. You never asked." Grove had read that letter once and put it away. He thought about it now, driving the supply wagon north on the road from Harrow Valley, and he thought about what a man might do with 20 years of unresolved grievance, and the particular patience of someone who has decided that the resolution will come eventually if he simply waits for the right conditions. When he got back to the property, Bet was at the north fence. He put the supplies away and went out to where she was working. She was setting a post in the corner where the north line met the creek drainage, a section of fence that had been giving him trouble for 3 years because the ground there was soft from the subsurface water and the posts never held the way they held in drier ground. She had found a solution. He had not thought of digging down farther than standard and packing the base of the hole with stones from the creek bed before setting the post, and she was doing this methodically and without apparent frustration, which was the correct way to approach any fence problem, but was easier to know than to feel on your knees in cold mud. He watched her work for a moment. Then he said, "Bet." She looked up. "When you're done with that post, there's something I need to tell you." She read his face. Whatever she saw there made her drive the post home and stand up and wipe her hands on her work trousers without him having to say anything more. "Tell me now," she said. So he told her. He told her what Maggie had said about Pacht's questions, and he told her what he knew of the history between their families, which was not as much as it should be, but was what he had. He told her about the letter his father had written and never sent, which he had not told anyone, which he told her now, because it seemed like information she should have. She listened without interrupting. She had the quality, when she was truly listening, of someone who had stilled every part of herself that was not engaged in the act of receiving information, and it made the things you said to her feel more consequential than they might have felt otherwise, because you knew they were being actually heard. When he finished, she looked out at the creek for a moment. "He was asking about outstanding business arrangements," she said. "That's what Maggie said. Your father had outstanding business with him. A debt. From the freighting arrangement. My father believed he had paid it. There was no paperwork to confirm it." Bet turned back to him. Her expression was the one he had come to recognize as her thinking expression, not blank, but concentrated, the face of someone sorting information into categories of relevance and implication. "Is there anyone who witnessed the payment?" "Edmund Troost, Maggie's husband. He was there when my father settled the account in person with Pacht in the spring of 1883. He paused. "Edmund died in 1884. But Maggie knows. Maggie knows." Bet was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "He has been waiting for the right time." "That's what I think. The right time being when you had something more to lose than just the land itself." Grove looked at her. She held his gaze steadily. "He did not move when your father died. He did not move in the years you were here alone. He moved when something changed." She paused. "I am the thing that changed." He had thought this, but had not said it, and hearing it said plainly by her had a quality of accuracy that was uncomfortable and necessary at the same time. "That's what I think," he said again. She picked up her tools from the ground. Then we need to understand exactly what he has and what it means and what our options are." She looked at him with the directness that was, he had come to understand, not hardness, but precision. "And I need to tell you something as well." He waited. "Not here," she said. "This evening. Over supper." She looked at the fence line. "Let me finish the corner post first." He left her to it and went back to his own work, and the rest of the afternoon had a quality that he recognized from certain mornings on the land when the weather was building toward something, and the work went on as it always went on, but the whole texture of the day was altered by the knowledge that something was coming and you did not yet know its full dimensions. That evening she told him. She told him plainly, as she did everything, starting with the facts and moving through them in order, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table and listened in the same way she had listened to him by the fence line, with his full attention and without interruption. Her father, Martin Farrow, had died 18 months ago. Before he died, he had written a will by hand in the presence of 2 neighbors who had both signed as witnesses. The will left the family's 200 acres in Kearney County to Bet, not to her brothers who had already left, not to the extended family, to Bet, who had stayed and worked the land through the bad years and the worst year and the year after that. The will had one problem. Nebraska statute required 2 witnesses to a handwritten will. Her father had 2 witnesses, Walter Greer, a neighbor who had since moved to Kansas, and Dorothy Clausen, a widow who lived 3 miles east of the Farrow property. Both had signed. But Silas Farrow, Bet's cousin on her father's side, had hired a lawyer in Lincoln who had filed a contest with the Kearney County Court. The contest argued that Dorothy Clausen's signature was invalid because she had been, according to the lawyer's brief, incompetent at the time of signing due to advanced age. Dorothy Clausen was 70 years old, and by every account, Bet had in full possession of her faculties. But Silas Farrow's lawyer had filed the contest, and the court had accepted it for review, and the review was ongoing, and until it was resolved, the disposition of the Farrow land was uncertain. "If the contest succeeds," Bet said, "and Dorothy's witness status is invalidated, then the will fails for insufficient witnesses, and the land would pass by intestate succession to Silas. He is the only male Farrow heir. Under Nebraska intestacy law, yes." She held his gaze. "I came here because I needed the arrangement to be legally established before the court ruled. A married woman's property rights in a contested estate are treated differently than an unmarried woman's. It does not fix the problem, but it changes the framing in ways that LeMay told me could matter." "Who is LeMay?" "Hector LeMay, a circuit lawyer out of Lincoln who came recommended to me by a woman I trust. He does frontier law. He is the one who advised me to establish the marriage before the ruling if I could." Grove sat with this for a moment. The stove made its small sounds. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the gap above the north window the way it always did in the evenings in October, the sound that had been the sound of the cabin for 4 years, and that he had never quite gotten around to caulking because it was not a large sound, and because, if he was honest, it had been a kind of company. "You came here to establish the marriage," he said. "Yes." "That was the primary reason." She looked at him steadily. "It was the reason I decided to answer the advertisement when I had not answered one before." "Yes." He was quiet. "You have a right to be angry," she said. "I would not argue with that. I'm not angry." She waited because the sentence had the rhythm of a sentence with more after it. "I'm thinking," he said, "about the difference between the reason someone does a thing and the thing itself." He looked at his hands on the table, the scarred knuckles, the permanent calluses. "You've been here 14 days. You fixed the damper on the stove and the gap in the bull's pen and 12 sections of the north fence. You made that corner post in ground that has beaten me for 3 years. You know the names of my horses and which ear Garrison favors when he's uncertain." He paused. "The reason you came here is what it is. The 14 days are what they are." She looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, something less contained than her usual expression, something that moved through it briefly and was controlled but not entirely contained. "There is something else," she said. He waited again. "The letter from Kearney County that came to Maggie's counter last week," she said. It was from Silas's lawyer, informing me that Silas is aware I have left Nebraska and is considering whether my departure constitutes abandonment of interest in the contested property. Does it? LeMay says no. Nebraska law does not require a claimant to reside on contested property during litigation, but it is the kind of argument that sounds plausible enough to delay proceedings and increase costs. She folded her hands on the table. And there is one more thing which I have not told you, which Silas's letter made clear for the first time. He looked at her. Silas knows where I am, she said. He has known since shortly after I arrived. I do not know how. She paused. The letter was addressed to me, care of Harrow Valley, Montana Territory. The wind moved through the gap above the window. Grove sat with all of it for a long time without speaking, and she let him sit with it, which was one of the things he had noticed about her from the beginning, that she understood when silence was what the moment required and did not try to fill it with reassurance or elaboration. He thought about Pacht asking Maggie about outstanding business arrangements. He thought about the timing of Pacht's questions 4 days ago, which was 10 days after Bet arrived. He thought about a man who had been patient for 20 years and who had recalibrated in the church pew when he saw what had changed at Danner Fork. He thought about a cousin in Nebraska who knew where Bet was. He thought 2 separate problems arriving at the same time from different directions. He thought, or possibly not entirely separate. Tomorrow morning, he said, I am going to ride into town and talk to Maggie about what she witnessed when my father paid that debt. And then I am going to find out what days Hector LeMay makes his circuit through this part of the territory. Bet looked at him. LeMay comes through the county seat first week of each month. He should be in Harrow Valley in 10 days. He looked at her. You already knew when he was coming. I wrote to him before I left Nebraska. He confirmed his schedule. Of course she had. He almost said it out loud. Of course she had planned this carefully and thoroughly because she was a careful and thorough person, and the fact that she had not told him the entirety of the plan from the beginning did not change the quality of the planning itself, which was the planning of someone who understood what was at stake and took it seriously. All right, he said. He stood up and cleared his plate. She stood and cleared hers. They washed the dishes the way they had washed them every evening for 2 weeks, working in the small kitchen with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned each other's dimensions and were no longer careful about the space between them. When the dishes were done, she went to the door and took her coat from the hook and put it on, and he saw that the pocket of the coat was empty. The letter from Silas's lawyer was somewhere else now, somewhere private, put away the way she put away things she had made a decision about. I'm going to check the gate latch before I turn in, she said. The east gate. The cold is making the metal contract, and it's not closing as clean as it should. He nodded. She went out. He stood at the kitchen table for a moment after she was gone, and he looked at the 2 plates drying on the rack and the 2 cups beside them. And he thought about a form on Maggie Trust's counter 3 winters ago and a pencil he had picked up without quite knowing why, and he thought about the particular way that important things begin, which is almost always not the way you expect them to begin. Not with fanfare or clarity, but with a small, ordinary decision that you will only recognize as important much later when you are standing in a kitchen looking at 2 plates on a drying rack and understanding that the shape of your life has shifted in a way that does not yet have a name. He heard the east gate latch click. He went to bed. Maggie Trust did not deal in half measures. This was true of her coffee, which was strong enough to serve as a moral position, and it was true of her information, which she provided with the same quality of completeness that she applied to every other form of commerce. When Grove came to her the following morning and asked what she knew about the payment of his father's debt to Pacht, she put the closed sign on the store door and sat him down in the back room where she kept her records, and she told him everything she knew, which was more than he had expected and more than was comfortable. Edmund Trust had been present in the spring of 1883 when Silas Danner came to Harrow Valley and met with Cornelius Pacht to settle the outstanding debt from the failed freighting arrangement of 1867. The meeting had taken place in the back room of Pacht's bank. Edmund had been there as an independent party because both men had agreed that an independent party was prudent. Silas Danner had paid the sum owed. Pacht had accepted it. There had been no paperwork generated at the meeting because Pacht had said he would prepare the formal release of the note the following week and send it to Silas. He had never sent it. Silas Danner had written twice asking for the paperwork. He had received no reply. He had, by Maggie's account of what Edmund had told her, concluded that Pacht simply intended to be unpleasant about it in the small ways available to a man who had lost money and not forgiven the losing of it, and had decided that pursuing the paperwork was more trouble than it was worth, since the debt was genuinely paid, and there were witnesses. Edmund Troost had died the following year, and Cornelius Pacht, it emerged, had at some point after that acquired the original promissory note from the failed freighting venture, which had been held by a land agent in Helena who had partly financed the original arrangement. The land agent had retired in 1880 and sold his papers to a legal clearinghouse in Butte, and the clearinghouse had sold individual instruments to various buyers, and one of the buyers had been Pacht. He bought his own guarantee, Grove said. He bought the original note, Maggie said, which still had no formal release attached to it, because he never prepared one. She looked at him over her coffee cup. He paid perhaps 15 cents on the dollar for it. The clearinghouse did not know the debt had been paid. They knew only that the note had no release. Grove sat with this. Edmund told me all of this, Maggie said. Before he died. He told me because he said he had a feeling it would matter eventually, and he wanted someone to know who would remember it and be here to say it. She set her cup down. Edmund was a man who paid attention to things. Pacht knows, you know. Pacht knows Edmund told me things. He does not know specifically what. He has never asked me directly, which is interesting in itself. She folded her hands on the table. I think he has always calculated that he could manage whatever I knew if the moment arose, because a widow's word in a legal proceeding against a banker's documentation has limited weight on its own. She paused. On its own. Grove understood what she was saying, but combined with other evidence. LeMay would know better than I would what it amounts to combined. She looked at him steadily. When does he come through? Bet says first week of next month. Then you have 10 days. Maggie picked up her cup again. And Grove. There is one more thing. He waited. Ruth Pacht came in yesterday, she said. She bought flour and thread. We talked for perhaps 20 minutes, which is longer than Ruth usually stays. She was quiet for a moment in a way that was not her usual quality of quiet. Ruth Pacht is not a foolish woman. She has not been a happy woman for some years, and she looked at me yesterday in a way that told me she is thinking about something very carefully. What kind of something? I don't know. But I have known Ruth Pacht for 15 years, and I know the difference between her buying flour and her buying flour and also working something out. She stood up and went to the door. I thought you should know that too. He rode back to the property thinking about all of it, turning each piece over the way you turn a stone to see what is underneath it. Pacht and the note. Maggie and what she knew. Ruth Pacht working something out in the back of her mind. Bet and her cousin's lawyer and a court in Nebraska that was reviewing a dead man's will. Two separate problems. He kept coming back to the question of whether they were entirely separate, and each time he came back to it, he found the same answer waiting for him, which was that he did not have enough information yet to know, and that not knowing was a form of vulnerability he could not afford to maintain. When he got back, Bet was at the south pasture fence, running her hand along the top wire, with the attention of someone reading by touch, checking for rust and weak spots and places where the tension had gone out of the line. She saw him come through the gate and finish the section she was on before she walked back to meet him. He told her what Maggie had said. She listened the same way she always listened completely, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, He has the note and no release. Your father paid, and there is one living witness. Maggie, whose testimony is the word of a widow against the documentation of a banker. She looked at the fence line. LeMay needs to see the note and hear Maggie's account and tell us what it amounts to. 10 days. 10 days. She turned back to him. There is something I can do in the meantime. There is a woman in Harrow Valley who has been here longer than almost anyone, Eleanor Marsh. She was pointed out to me at the church by the Reverend's wife, who mentioned that she had known most of the families in the valley from their earliest days. I know Eleanor. She is sharp. I want to talk to her about the history between your family and Pacht, about what this valley knows that it has not said out loud. She held his gaze. Sometimes what a place knows and has not said out loud is the most important thing. He nodded. Go today if you want. Take the gray mare, she's steadier on the road than the bay. She went. He worked the afternoon alone, which was not unusual and which should have felt the same as it always felt and did not. He was aware of her absence in the specific way that you become aware of a sound only after it has stopped. He went about his work, the calf pen repair he had been putting off, and the water trough that needed recaulking before the freeze. And he did the work well because he always did his work well. But underneath the work, there was a quality of attention directed outward toward the road that he recognized and did not entirely know what to do with. She came back in the early evening just ahead of the dark. He was at the barn when he heard the gray mare on the road, and he waited at the barn door rather than going to the gate, because going to the gate would have been a statement about something, and he was not yet ready to make it. She came through the gate, saw him, and rode to the barn. She dismounted with the efficiency she brought to everything physical and led the mare inside and began unsaddling her. Eleanor Marsh talked to me for 2 hours, she said. She was not looking at him. Her hands were moving through the unsaddling with the practiced rhythm of long habit. She is, as you said, sharp. She is also someone who has been paying attention to this valley for 30 years and has not had anyone ask her the right questions in some time. What did she tell you? Bet ran the brush along the mare's flank. She told me that Neil Pact was not always the man he is now. She said that 20 years ago, before the financial difficulties with your father's arrangement, he was considered a fair man. Hard in business, but fair. That there was a change after the losses. She paused in her brushing. She told me that Pact lost a child in 1869, an infant son, and that he blamed the circumstances of that year, the financial strain, the inadequate care they could afford during a time when money was short for the loss. Grove was quiet. He needed someone to hold responsible for the financial strain, Bet said. And your father's withdrawal from the arrangement was the most available explanation for why the money was short. She resumed brushing. Eleanor said that Ruth Pact has carried the grief of that child without the bitterness that Pact developed, that Ruth never held your family responsible, but that she has also never been in a position to say so. Grove thought about Ruth Pact's face in the church, the quality of tiredness in it that was not the tiredness of age but something older and more settled than that. Eleanor told you all of this, he said. She told me because I asked the right questions. Bet finished with the brush and hung it on the post. She also told me something else. She told me that Ruth Pact came to her last week, that they spoke privately, that she did not know what was said, but that Ruth left looking like a person who has made a decision. Maggie's words came back to him. Ruth Pact, working something out. 2 women in the same week, he said. 2 women who have been watching the same situation for a long time. Bet looked at him across the mare's back. I think Ruth Pact is going to do something. I don't know what, but I think it is coming. He thought about that on his way back to the cabin and at supper and in the silence after supper when they sat with their coffee. He thought about grief that becomes grievance and patience that becomes a kind of slow damage and the particular loneliness of a woman who has watched her husband carry something corrosive for 20 years and has not had the standing to put it down for him. The fire settled in the stove. Bet said, "There is something I want to ask you." He looked at her. "The chair," she said. "By the stove. You don't sit in it." He was quiet. "I have been here 2 weeks and I have not sat in it either," she said, "because I could see it was not a chair that was available, but I want to understand what I am seeing." Grove looked at the chair. It was a good chair, well-made, a rocker with a cane seat that he had bought in the first year when he thought the cabin would have 2 people in it who would want to sit in the evenings. He had never moved it. He had never sat in it. "Clara," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the fire shifted and settled again, and the wind found the gap above the north window and said what it had to say and moved on. "She sat in that chair the first winter," he said finally. "She sat there in the evenings, and I sat here, and that was what the evenings looked like. When she left, I did not know what to do with the chair. Moving it seemed like something. Leaving it seemed like something else. I left it." "What did the letter say, the one she left?" He looked at her. She held his gaze without apology. She was not asking to wound him. She was asking because she was a person who believed that things needed to be looked at directly to be understood. She said she was not the right person for this life, he said. She said she had tried to be and found she was not. She said she did not think I was wrong, and she did not think she was wrong. She said we were simply not the same kind of people. Did you believe her? I believed that she was being honest. He turned his cup in his hands. Whether I believed the conclusion is something I worked on for a long time. And now I think she was right about what she said and wrong about what it meant. He looked at the fire through the grate. She said we were not the same kind of people. I think what she meant was that she could not stay. I think those are different statements. Bet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When I was 22, I was told by a man I had considered worth listening to that a woman who could not make herself smaller than she was would always be alone, that there was no place in a life with another person for a woman who took up as much space as I took up." She looked at her hands. I believed him for about 6 months. Then I stopped believing him. But believing something for 6 months and not believing it anymore are different things from never having believed it. He looked at her. "I came here for the legal protection," she said. "That is true, but I also came here because you wrote in your third letter that you were not well served by people who made themselves small, and I had not read that sentence anywhere before, not in anyone's letter, not in anyone's conversation." She met his eyes. "I wanted to meet the person who wrote it, even if everything else turned out to be a mistake." Grove said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "It is not a mistake." She held his gaze. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching who did not know her would have noticed. But he had been watching her for 2 weeks with the full attention he brought to things that mattered, and he noticed. She picked up her cup and finished her coffee and stood up. "I'm going to check the damper before I turn in," she said. "It has been sticking again on the right side." "Left side," he said. "It has always been the left." She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a smile he had seen from her. "Left side," she said. "I know." She went to the stove. He sat at the table and watched the fire through the grate and thought about a sentence he had written in a letter in July that he had meant as a plain statement of what was true, and that had apparently traveled 200 miles and been read by a person who had needed to read it. And he thought about how things move through the world, the things you mean and the things you say and the distance between them, and how sometimes rarely those two things are the same. He thought about Pacht and the note and Maggie's testimony and LeMay coming in 10 days. He thought about Ruth Pacht working something out. He thought about a chair by the stove that had been a chair for one person for 4 years, and about whether a chair was ever really just a chair. He stayed at the table until the fire had gone down to coals. Then he got up and went to bed. And for the first time since she had arrived, he did not lie awake in the dark thinking about the sounds of the cabin. He simply listened to them, her stillness on the other side of the wall, the creek beyond the tree line, the October wind that would be November wind before long, and he closed his eyes, and the last thing he thought before he slept was this 10 days. Whatever was coming, there were 10 days to be ready for it. He would use them well. On the morning of the 10th day, Hector LeMay rode into Harrow Valley on a roan horse that had seen better years, and carried himself with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been moving through difficult country long enough that difficult country had stopped being a category he thought about separately from any other kind. He was 48 years old, Louisiana Creole, with a face that told you he had seen enough of human difficulty to have stopped being surprised by it without having stopped being interested in it. He wore a good coat that had weathered badly and kept his papers in a leather case that had weathered well, which told you something about what he considered worth protecting. He had been riding the circuit between the county seat and the outlying settlements for 11 years, and in 11 years of frontier law, he had learned that the most useful thing a lawyer could do for most of his clients was to tell them clearly and quickly what they were actually dealing with rather than what they feared they were dealing with. Because what people feared and what was true were frequently different animals, and confusing them cost everyone time and money they could not afford. Bet had arranged the meeting through Maggie's counter, a letter sent 10 days before confirming the date and the time and the location, which was the back room of Maggie's store where Grove had sat 2 weeks ago and learned what Maggie knew about his father's debt. Maggie had made coffee strong enough to qualify as a statement of intent, and had set out 3 cups and then removed herself to the front of the store on the grounds that she already knew what she knew and did not need to hear it organized by a lawyer. Grove and Bet sat on one side of the table. LeMay sat on the other and opened his case and took out a notebook and a pen and asked them to tell him everything from the beginning, and they did, taking turns without having arranged whose turn it was, each picking up where the other left off in the way that people do when they have been thinking about the same problem together for long enough that the problem has acquired a shared shape. LeMay wrote. He asked precise questions when he needed precision and did not ask questions when the information was clear. When they had finished, he looked at his notes for a moment and then looked up. He addressed the Danner debt first. The promissory note Pacht held was a genuine instrument, he said. It had been properly executed in 1867 and had passed through legitimate hands to reach Pacht, and the fact that the underlying debt had been paid did not automatically void the instrument if there was no formal release attached to it. This was the core of Pacht's position, and it was not without legal foundation. However, Maggie Trust's testimony as an eyewitness to the payment was admissible under Montana territorial law. The weight of that testimony against the documentary evidence of the note would depend on the judge, but LeMay had appeared before every judge in this territory, and he knew which ones weighed testimony heavily and which ones weighed paper heavily. And the judge who sat the Beaverhead Circuit was a man who had been a rancher before he was a lawyer, and understood that out here agreements were made in rooms without notaries present because that was the practical reality of frontier commerce, and he gave eyewitness testimony its proper weight. Furthermore, LeMay continued the manner in which Pacht had acquired the note was itself a point of contention. If it could be shown that Pacht knew the debt had been paid when he purchased the note, the instrument could be challenged as acquired in bad faith. Grove did not yet have evidence of this, but the fact that Pacht had been present at the payment, had accepted the money, had promised to prepare a release and had not done so, and had subsequently purchased the instrument through an intermediary, created at minimum a pattern that a good lawyer could turn into an argument. "I am a good lawyer," LeMay said without inflection, as a statement of professional fact. Then he turned to the Nebraska matter. He had reviewed the situation before coming, having received Bet's letter weeks ago, and made his own inquiries through a colleague in Lincoln. The contest filed by Silas Farrow's attorney was technically competent but substantively thin. The claim of Dorothy Clausen's incompetence at the time of witnessing was going to be difficult to sustain against a woman who was 70 years old, in possession of her faculties and willing to appear and testify, which she had indicated to Bet's satisfaction that she was willing to do. The problem, LeMay said, was procedural. The contest was filed in Kearney County, and the resolution would happen in Kearney County, and the court there had set a date for preliminary hearing that was 6 weeks away. Bet needed her evidence in order before that date. Specifically, she needed Dorothy Clausen's testimony in a form the court would accept, which meant a sworn statement taken before a notary public in Nebraska with the proper attestations. Someone needed to go to Nebraska. Grove said, "I will go." LeMay looked at him for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook. He said that Grove, as Bet's husband, could appear in the Kearney County proceedings as her representative of record, which had practical utility since Bet could not be in two places at once, and the Montana situation also required attention. He said he would write a letter of introduction to the notary office in Minden, the nearest town to the Clausen property, and a second letter for Dorothy Clausen herself, explaining the legal purpose of the visit. He said that a sworn statement from Clausen, properly notarized, combined with whatever statement Walter Greer could be located to provide, would almost certainly be sufficient to defeat the incompetence argument and validate the will. He looked at Grove. 4 days each way on horseback, he said. 2 or 3 days in Nebraska if the witnesses were cooperative. Call it 10 days total if nothing goes wrong. Grove said, "I have left the property for longer than that." LeMay closed his notebook. He looked at both of them in the way of a man making a professional assessment rather than a personal judgment. He said the two situations are connected in their timing, but not necessarily in their origin. However, the timing is worth noting. Someone in Nebraska communicated your location to Silas Farrow's lawyer shortly after your arrival here. That communication reached Harrow Valley through channels that I would encourage you to think carefully about. He did not say more than that about the timing. But before he picked up his case, he looked at both of them across the table with the assessment quality that had been in his eyes throughout the meeting. He said, "Before I ride out, there is a practical matter worth addressing." Grove. If you go to Nebraska as Bet's representative of record, the court in Kearney will ask about the nature of that representation. A neighbor cannot represent a claimant in a contested estate proceeding. A business associate cannot. A husband can. Grove looked at him. LeMay said, "I am not suggesting anything. I am telling you what the court will ask." The back room of Maggie's store was quiet. Outside, someone was unloading a wagon on the street, the sound of crates being set down on wood, ordinary work going on in ordinary time. Grove looked at Bet. She looked back at him with the expression he had come to recognize as her thinking expression, not blank but concentrated, moving through the information quickly and arriving at the same place he was arriving. She said, "It is a practical matter." He said, "Yes." She said, "LeMay can witness it." He said, "Maggie is next door." Bet stood up and went to the door that connected the back room to the front of the store. She said, "Maggie, when you have a moment." Maggie appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of a woman who has been listening through a door and wishes to appear as though she has not. She looked at LeMay. She looked at Grove. She looked at Bet. She said, "Well, it is about time." What followed took less than 10 minutes. Frontier marriage by declaration before witnesses was not the church ceremony that November would bring, but it was legally sufficient in Montana Territory in 1887, and LeMay knew the language required and spoke it without ceremony, which was the correct way to handle a moment that was practical in its occasion and something else entirely in its meaning. Grove said what needed to be said. Bet said what needed to be said. LeMay wrote it in his notebook and signed it, and Maggie signed it, and the thing was done. When LeMay closed his notebook, he looked at them both with the expression of a man who has seen enough of human difficulty to recognize when something has gone the other way. He said, "I will file the declaration with the county office on my next circuit. It will be on record before you reach Nebraska." He picked up his case and thanked Maggie for the coffee and rode out to his next appointment, which was a property dispute on the other side of the valley that had been generating correspondence for 2 years and showed no sign of resolving itself through correspondence alone. Grove and Bet sat back down at the table. The coffee had gone cold. She said, "That was not how I imagined it." He said no. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she said, "November will be different." He said it will. She said Maggie will cry. He said Maggie will deny crying. The corner of Bet's mouth moved. It was not quite the smile he had seen from her once before, but it was in the same territory, and he filed it in the same place he had filed the other one, which was the place where he kept the things that mattered without making decisions about them yet. Bet said, "I will manage the property while you are gone." He looked at her. She held his gaze with the steadiness he had come to expect from her. "I have been managing property since I was 16, she said. 10 days is not beyond me." He knew this was true and said so, and the matter was settled. He left on a Tuesday morning before the sun was over the eastern ridge, but the morning did not begin with his leaving. It began with a knock at the gate. He heard it from the barn where he was finishing the pack bags. A single knock, not the knock of someone uncertain, but the knock of someone who had decided to come and had come. He went to the gate and found Ruth Pacht standing on the roadside of it in the early dark alone without a horse, which meant she had walked from the Pacht property, which was 1.5 miles by the road. She was dressed for the cold. She was carrying nothing except a small envelope in her right hand, held at her side, not extended yet. He opened the gate. She did not come through it. She looked at him for a moment and then looked past him toward the cabin where the lamp was already lit, and he could see through the window that Bet was at the stove. Ruth said, "I would like to speak to your wife." He said, "Come in." She shook her head. She said, "Out here is fine. Would you ask her to come out?" He went and got Bet. He did not explain. She read his face the way she read everything and came without asking questions, pulling her coat on as she walked. When Bet came through the gate, Ruth Pacht looked at her for a long moment. The two women were nearly the same height, which Grove had not noticed before, and they stood in the early morning dark with the particular quality of two people who have been watching each other from a distance and are now for the first time at close range. Ruth held out the envelope. Bet took it. Ruth said, "My husband received payment on that debt in the spring of 1883. He promised a release. He drafted one. He never sent it." She paused. "When Edmund Troost died the following year, I understood that the only witness outside my husband and your father-in-law was gone, and I understood what that meant for what my husband was holding. Bet looked at the envelope in her hand. Ruth said, "I have kept that draft for 4 years. I told myself it was not my place to interfere in my husband's business." She was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about that." Bet opened the envelope. Inside was a single-page handwritten dated April 1883. At the top, in Pacht's careful hand, release of promissory note, Danner Pacht Freighting Arrangement, 1867. The body of it laid out the terms of the release in the formal language of a man who understood legal documents. At the bottom, a signature line with Pacht's name printed beneath it, and above the line blank. He had written it, and never signed it, and never sent it. The draft of the thing he had promised to do and had not done in his own handwriting in his own hand, dated to the week he had promised to do it. Bet looked up from the document. Ruth said, "I am not asking for anything. I am not asking you to think well of my husband or to forgive him or to make this easier for him than it needs to be." She held Bet's gaze steadily. "I am asking you to have what is yours." She turned and walked back down the road toward the Pacht property without looking back. Grove and Bet stood at the gate and watched her go until the dark took her. After a moment, Bet folded the document carefully and put it inside her coat close to her chest where it would stay dry. "He said LeMay needs to see that before I leave. She said I will ride to Maggie's this morning and have it copied and witnessed before you are out of the valley. He said Ruth Pacht walked 1.5 miles in the dark to bring that to you." Bet looked down the empty road. She said yes. She did. Neither of them said anything else about it. There was not much to say that the document and the walk and the dark did not already say more precisely. He went back to the barn and finished the pack bags. She rode to Maggie's. By the time he was saddled and ready, she was back, and she handed him a witnessed copy of the draft release to add to his document case alongside LeMay's letters of introduction. She checked the pack bags one final time. He swung up into the saddle. She stood at the barn door and looked up at him. She said, "Dorothy Clausen lives 3 miles north of Minden. Red-painted house. Crab-apple tree by the front gate, not apple crab-apple. She will not open the door to a stranger without reason. Give her LeMay's letter first before you say anything about yourself." He said he understood. She said the road south of the Yellowstone runs soft on the west side after rain. "Stay to the east of the creek crossing at the bottom of the grade." He said he knew the crossing. She looked at him for a moment longer. The October light was thin and the air had the clean, cold quality of a morning that had not yet decided how hard it intended to be. She said, "Come back with what we need." He said, "I intend to." He rode out through the gate and down the road south and did not look back, not because he was not thinking about what he was leaving, but because looking back was not something he did, had never been something he did, and starting now would not have made the leaving easier or the destination closer. The ride to Nebraska took 4 days. He crossed the Yellowstone on the second day, and the land began to change as he moved south and east, the mountains pulling back from the horizon, and the sky opening ahead of him in the way that Bet had described more sky than a person used to mountains knew what to do with, flat and wide and continuous, in a way that was not empty, but was differently full than the country he lived in. He understood what she had meant about the eyes getting tired. There was nothing to rest them on. Everything was the same distance away. He made Kearney County on the afternoon of the 4th day. Minden was a town of modest ambitions and practical construction, the kind of town that had been built by people who intended to stay but had not yet decided whether to be proud of staying. He found a room at the boarding house on the main street and ate supper in the dining room, and in the morning he went to the notary office and presented LeMay's letter of introduction to a man named Aldous Prescott, who read it carefully and said he was familiar with LeMay's work and would be available to receive sworn testimony if Grove could produce the witness. Then Grove rode 3 miles north of town to a red-painted house with a crab-apple tree by the front gate. Dorothy Clausen was 70 years old and had the face of a woman who had spent 7 decades being interested in what the world was doing and had not yet run out of interest. She was small and precise in her movements, and she answered the door before he had finished knocking, which suggested she had seen him coming up the road and had decided while watching him approach whether to open the door. She read LeMay's letter standing in the doorway. Then she read it again. She looked up at him. "You are married to Beatrice Farrow," she said. "Yes, ma'am. She came a long way to find you." "I think we found each other," he said, "at something like the same time." Dorothy Clausen looked at him with the particular attention of a woman who has been reading people for 7 decades and is seldom wrong about what she reads. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in. I have made coffee, and you have had a long ride, and what I have to say to a notary does not need a long introduction." Inside her kitchen, which was warm and ordered and smelled of the coffee she had made and something baking under it, she told him what she remembered of the afternoon Martin Farrow had asked her to witness his will. She remembered it with the clarity that important moments sometimes carry, regardless of how much time has passed the kitchen table where Martin had spread the paper the winter light through the south window. Walter Greer standing by the door with his hat in his hands because he had never been comfortable in houses herself. Seated across from Martin, the pen that had run dry once and had to be refilled, Martin's hand shaking slightly from the cold or from the seriousness of the moment. She had watched him sign. She had signed herself. Walter Greer had signed. She said, "I know what Silas's lawyer claims about my faculties. I was 70 years old, not 30, and there is a difference. But I knew what I was signing, and I knew what Martin Farrow intended, and I will say so to anyone in any room they care to put me in. Grove said the room would be the Kearny County Courthouse in 6 weeks. She said I am 70 years old, and I have not left this county in 4 years, and I am not going to start now. But I will give my testimony to Mr. Prescott in Minden and sign what needs signing. And if the court in Kearny cannot accept a sworn and notarized statement from a woman of my age and standing, then the court in Kearny has a problem that has nothing to do with Beatrice Farrow." He took her to Minden the following morning in her own wagon because she said riding was not something her back permitted anymore, and she said it with the matter-of-fact quality of a woman who had made her accommodations with age and was not interested in sympathy about them. Prescott took her statement with the care of a man who understood its importance, asked his clarifying questions, and produced a document that bore the seals and signatures that LeMay had specified as necessary. Dorothy Clausen signed it in a hand that was slower than it might once have been and entirely legible. Then Grove asked her about Walter Greer. Greer had moved to Kansas 2 years ago, she said, a town called Dodge, which was the kind of town a man moved to when he wanted to be in a place that had more going on than Minden, Nebraska. She had an address for him, a cousin's house where he boarded, and she wrote it on a piece of paper and gave it to Grove and said she supposed Dodge City was not so far out of his way going back to Montana if he went by a particular route that she described, which was in fact considerably out of his way, but which she described with the confidence of someone who had decided the detour was worthwhile and expected him to agree. He agreed. He rode 2 days west to Dodge City and found Walter Greer at his cousin's boarding house, older than Dorothy Clausen's description had led him to expect, with the weathered look of a man who had spent most of his life outside and the wary quality of someone who had been approached about this matter before and had not found the previous approach comfortable. Grove told him plainly who he was and what he was asking and why. Greer said Silas Farrow sent a man here 6 months ago. Grove said, "What did that man want?" Greer said he wanted me to say I did not remember signing the will clearly, that I had been having a bad season and was not at my best that day. Grove said, "Were you?" Greer said I was perfectly fine that day. Martin Farrow served good whiskey after we signed, and I remember every particular because it was good whiskey. Grove said, "Will you give a sworn statement to that effect?" Greer was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table between them, and then he looked at Grove and he said, "That little girl worked that land for 3 years after everyone else left. I watched her do it from my fence. She is not a little girl anymore, and she has not been for a long time, but that is how I think of her. Martin Farrow wanted her to have that land, and she earned it 6 times over." He paused. "Take me to whoever needs to hear me say so." The Dodge City notary was a woman named Frances Holt, who had been doing the job for 8 years, and who took Greer's statement with the efficiency of someone who had taken a great many statements and understood that efficiency was a form of respect for the people giving them. Walter Greer signed. Grove rode north out of Dodge City with 2 notarized statements in his leather document case, which he kept dry with the same care that LeMay kept his papers dry, because he understood now in a way he had not entirely understood before what paper could mean, what it could protect, and what the absence of it could cost. The ride back was 4 days in the other direction, and he used the time the way he used all extended time alone, thinking about things that required thinking without the interruption of the work, which was to say carefully and without arriving at any conclusions he had not already begun to reach. He thought about the two statements in his document case and what they would mean for the Kearney County Court. He thought about LeMay and Maggie and the debt and Pacht and what the next conversation with Pacht was going to look like and how it needed to go. He thought about a woman managing his property alone for 10 days and whether she was managing it the way he would manage it, and then he stopped thinking about that because it was a question with an obvious answer. And the obvious answer was that she was probably managing it better in several specific respects he could already identify. What he did not know, and would not know until he returned, was that on the 7th day, Owen Pacht had come to the property. He had arrived in the late morning with a load of split firewood in his wagon, enough to last 2 weeks, and he had stacked it against the north wall of the barn without being asked, because the stack Bet had been working from was running low, and he had seen that when he rode past 3 days before and had not said anything then, and had come back now with the wood. Bet watched him stack it from the barn door. When he was done, he stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the property the way his father looked at property, which was to say with the eyes of someone doing arithmetic. Then he looked at her. He said, "I know what my father has been doing." She said nothing. He said, "I don't know yet what I'm going to do about it, but I wanted you to know that I know." He got back on his wagon and drove out. Bet stood at the barn door and watched him go and thought that 24 years old was a difficult age to find out that the picture you had of your father was not the whole picture. She thought Owen Pacht was going to be all right eventually. She thought eventually was going to take a while. Then she went back to work. He thought about what she had said at the kitchen table, about the man who had told her she would always be alone, about 6 months of believing it, about the difference between not believing something anymore and never having believed it. He thought about what he had said in return that it was not a mistake, and he thought about whether he had meant it as a reassurance or as a statement of what was true. And he concluded somewhere on the second day of the ride back north through country that was becoming his country again as the mountains returned to the horizon, that he had meant it as a statement of what was true, and that he had known it was true when he said it, which was the only basis on which he said anything. He arrived back at Danner Fork on the afternoon of the 11th day. The gate was closed and latched, and the latch moved smoothly, which meant she had fixed the east gate the way she had said she would. The yard was in order. The barn door was open, and he could hear activity inside before he reached it. She was at the far stall examining the left rear leg of his bay horse with the focused attention of a diagnostician. She heard him come in and looked up once and then looked back at the horse's leg. "The leg is sound," she said. "There was some heat in it 4 days ago. I have been monitoring it. It is resolved." He dismounted and led his own horse into the adjacent stall and began unsaddling. She said, "How was the ride?" "Long," he said. "Productive." She said, "Both witnesses." "Both witnesses," he said. "Notarized. LeMay's specifications." She stood up from the horse's leg and turned to look at him fully. Something moved through her expression and was controlled before it had fully arrived, but he had been watching her for 3 weeks now, and he caught it before it was gone. And what it was relief of the particular kind that a person feels when they have been holding something carefully for a long time, and someone has finally come to help them hold it. She said, "Thank you." He said, "It is your land." She said, "I know." "Thank you anyway." He handed her the document case. She took it with both hands and held it the way you hold something that represents more than its physical weight carefully and with awareness of what it cost to produce. She said, "Pacht came while you were gone." He stopped with the saddle half lifted. She said, "Day 6. He came alone. He sat at the kitchen table and he told me something you need to know." She told him what Pacht had said. She told him at the kitchen table, which was where the important things in the life of this cabin seemed to get said, and he listened, the way he always listened to things that mattered without interruption, and without the kind of reactive expression that caused people to edit what they were telling you. Pacht had come on the 6th morning of Grove's absence. He had knocked at the door, which he had not done before, and he had sat down when offered a chair, and he had looked at his hands on the table for a long moment before he began. He had said, "I want to tell you something before this goes further than it needs to." Bet had said, "Tell me." He had said, "The note I hold on Silas Danner's debt is legitimate paper. I acquired it legitimately. But I acquired it knowing the debt had been paid because I was present when it was paid, and I was the one who promised to prepare the release and did not do it. I did not do it on purpose. I kept the note and I acquired the instrument, and I have been holding both for 3 years. I knew what I was doing. She had said, "Why are you telling me this now?" He had looked at her for a long time before he answered. He had said, "Because I came here 6 days ago, and your husband was not here. And I sat at this table and I looked at what was in front of me, which was the woman he had brought to this property, and I thought about what I was proposing to do and what it would cost. Not him, not the land. I thought about what it would cost me. To be the kind of man who does this kind of thing." She had said, "You have been the kind of man who does this kind of thing for 3 years." He had said, "Yes, I have. And I am standing at the end of those 3 years looking back along them, and they are not 3 years I am satisfied with." She had said nothing. He had said, "I want you to know that what I told your husband about the valley, about the road repairs and the hay prices and the coming winter, I meant all of that as actual neighborliness. I am aware that you have no reason to believe that given the rest of it. I am telling you anyway because it is true." He had looked at his hands again. He had said, "I also want you to know that I wrote a letter to a colleague in Lincoln, Nebraska in October shortly after you arrived. I mentioned your name and where you had come from. I did not know that colleague had a connection to Silas Farrow's attorney. I am not certain he does. But I wrote the letter at a time when I was thinking about what your arrival meant for my plans, and I mentioned your name, and I think you should know that." Bet finished telling it and looked at Grove across the table. He was quiet for a long time. "He said he told you he might be the reason Silas knows where you are." She said he told me he wrote a letter that might have led to it. He said he did not know for certain. Grove thought about this. About a man who had driven 20 years of patient calculation from the fuel of a grief he had never properly processed, who had sat at this kitchen table in front of a woman he had not expected and said things that required more honesty than calculation. He said, "What did you say to him?" She said, "I told him that the land dispute in Nebraska had its own resolution coming. I told him that LeMay would be handling the note here in Montana. I told him that if he intended to pursue the note, he would need to do it on the public record where Maggie Trust's testimony and the history of the instrument's acquisition would also become part of the record. I told him that I understood men did things for reasons that were not simple, and that I was not interested in judging the reasons if he was prepared to stop doing the thing." Grove said, "And?" She said he sat with that for a while. Then he said he would contact LeMay directly about withdrawing his position on the note. He said he would do it through proper channels and in writing. Grove said, "You believe him?" She looked at him steadily. "I believe he is tired," she said. 20 years is a long time to carry something. I think the weight finally exceeded whatever satisfaction the carrying was providing. He sat with all of it. Then he said, "I need to go see him." She said, "I know." He said, "Not about the note. LeMay will handle the note. I need to go see him about something else." She looked at him, and he did not say what else was, and she did not ask because she had been reading him for 3 weeks now, and she knew when he had said everything he was going to say on a subject, and when there was more he needed to work out on his own before he could say it. He rode to the Pacht property the following morning. It was a large property, 3,000 acres of timber and pasture on the Bitterroot slope, with a main house that was the largest structure in the valley, and had been built by a man who understood that in a place where size was a language, a large house said something specific and intended. Grove had been on this property twice before, both times at Pacht's invitation, both times for conversations that had the quality of negotiations about something that was never named directly. This time he went without an invitation. Pacht was at the barn when Grove rode in. He saw Grove coming, and he did not go inside or call for anyone. He set down what he was carrying and waited. Grove dismounted, and they stood in the barnyard in the morning light, 2 large men occupying the space with the unconscious authority of people who had spent their lives in outdoor work and did not shrink from physical situations. Grove said, "My wife told me you came while I was gone." Pacht said, "I did." Grove said, "She told me what you said." Pacht said, "She is a direct woman." Grove said, "She is." They were quiet for a moment. A horse moved in the barn behind Pacht, and the sound of it filled the space between them briefly, and then settled. Grove said, "My father withdrew from your arrangement in 1867 because he knew the route was going to fail. He had information from 2 men who had tried to run freight on that road the previous winter and had lost equipment and time they could not afford. He took their word for it, and he got out. Pacht looked at him. Grove said he did not tell you because he was not certain his information was right, and he did not want to be responsible for your decision. He thought if he told you and he was wrong, you would have made a different choice based on bad information, and he would bear some responsibility for that. So he made his own choice and left you to make yours. Pacht was very still. Grove said he was wrong not to tell you. I know that. He should have told you what he knew and let you decide. That was the right thing, and he did not do it. But what he did not do was abandon you carelessly, or make a decision about your money without caring about the consequence. He was trying to protect you from information he was not sure he could stand behind. Pacht looked away. He looked at the timber on the ridge to the west. His timber, the ridge that bordered Grove's north fence line, and he looked at it for a long time. He said, "That does not explain why he would not answer my letters afterward." Grove said, "I do not know why he did not answer your letters. I found a letter he wrote to you that he never sent. He said in it that he would have explained himself if you had asked. I think he was waiting for you to ask. Pacht said I was waiting for him to explain. 2 men, Grove said, waiting for the other one to go first." Pacht was quiet. He put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the ground, and Grove watched him and thought about what Bet had said about a man being tired, and thought that what he was looking at was the face of a man who had found his way to the end of a road he had been walking for 20 years and had discovered that the road did not end where he had expected. Pacht said, "Your father chose the land for its water." Grove said he did. Pacht said he had a good eye. "The water in this valley is what makes it worth anything. Without the creek system, you have good grass and nothing else." He understood that. Grove said yes. Pacht said so did I when I came here. We were looking at the same things, your father and I, in the beginning. He said it the way a man says something that costs him something. Not dramatically. Just plainly the way plain things sound when they have been held back for a long time and are finally let out. Grove said nothing. He understood that there were moments when saying nothing was the most useful contribution you could make. Pacht said, "LeMay is a capable man." Grove said so, he tells us. Pacht said, "I will contact him this week. The note should have been properly released years ago. I will see to it that it is." He did not apologize. Grove did not ask for an apology. What had passed between them in the barnyard was not an apology, and it was not a reconciliation, and it was not the end of 20 years of difficulty resolved into a clean conclusion. It was 2 men standing in a yard acknowledging the shape of what had happened, which was the most honest thing available, and which was in Grove's experience usually enough to build something on if both men chose to build. He rode back to Danner Fork. Bet was at the north fence, the corner post she had set in the soft ground by the creek drainage, checking its stability after 10 days of cold and the beginning of the freeze that would lock the ground solid within a week. She looked up when she heard the horse on the road. He came through the gate and rode to where she was standing. He said LeMay will get his letter. She said, "And the other thing." He said the other thing also. She looked at him for a moment with the reading quality that had been in her eyes since the first day, the quality that went beyond the surface of a situation and found what the situation was actually made of. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone who has received information that confirms what she had already concluded. She turned back to the fence post and rocked it with both hands. It held. She said, "This one will make the winter." He got off his horse and tied it to the line post and came to look at the corner post. He tested it himself, his hands alongside the marks her hands had made in the loose soil around the base. It was solid. Better than solid. It was the kind of work that would outlast the winter and the spring after it, and several springs after that. He said, "Good work." She said, "The ground here is going to give us trouble every year until we get drainage on the south side of the line. I have been thinking about how to approach it." He said, "Tell me." She told him while they walked the fence line back toward the barn, the late afternoon light going gold on the western ridge, and the first cold of the coming night moving down from the higher ground, and she talked about drainage and post placement and the particular quality of the subsurface water in the creek margin with the fluency of someone who had been thinking about this problem seriously for weeks and had arrived at a solution she was confident in. He listened and asked 2 questions, and she answered both of them with the precision he had come to expect from her, and by the time they reached the barn he understood the solution and thought it was correct and said so. She said, "We can start on it in the spring when the ground opens up." He said, "We will." The word sat in the cold air between them, and neither of them mentioned it, but both of them heard it, the particular quality of a word that has shifted from being the way you refer to yourself to being the way you refer to something larger than yourself, and how that shift, when it happens, honestly is one of the few changes that does not feel like loss. They went inside and made supper and ate it and washed the dishes and sat at the table afterward with their coffee, and the fire in the stove made its small sounds, and the wind moved through the gap above the north window and said what it had to say about the coming winter. Bet said, "There is one more thing I need to tell you." He looked at her. She said, "I wrote to Dorothy Clausen before you went to Nebraska, before LeMay came. I wrote to ask whether she would be willing to testify. She wrote back and said she would. I did not tell you because I did not want you to think the trip to Nebraska was unnecessary if she had already agreed. The notarization still needed to happen in person, but I want you to know I had already spoken to her." He looked at her for a moment. "He said you were preparing the ground before we knew which way we were going to plant." She said, "I always do." He almost smiled. He said, "I know." She said, "I also wrote to LeMay with additional information about the note that I had gathered from Eleanor Marsh and from conversations in the town. I did not tell you because I was not certain what it amounted to until LeMay confirmed it was useful." He said, "What else?" She said, "Silas will receive LeMay's filed response to his lawyer next week. LeMay believes he will drop the contest when he understands that both witnesses have given sworn statements and that the competence argument has no foundation to stand on. He believes Silas does not actually want to go before a judge with what he has. Grove said LeMay has good instincts. Bet said he does." She paused. She said, "I want to sell the Nebraska land." He looked at her. She said, "I fought for it because my father left it to me, and because Silas had no right to it, and because allowing an unjust outcome to stand, because it is easier than contesting it, is not something I am willing to do. But I do not want to farm Nebraska. I want to farm here." She said it plainly, looking at him directly, and he understood that she was saying more than one thing at once, the way that plain statements sometimes contain more than their surface, and he sat with it for a moment to make sure he understood what all of it was. He said, "That land is yours. Whatever you decide to do with it is yours to decide." She said, "I know. I am telling you what I have decided because it affects this property, and you should know. The money from the sale would fund the drainage work on the north fence line and expand the west pasture and purchase 3 additional breeding cows. I have been doing the accounting." He said, "When?" She said, "For a while." He said, "You were planning to stay before you decided to stay." She looked at him. She said, "I was considering what staying would require." "That is different from deciding." He said, "When did you decide?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "The 4th day. You had fixed the water bucket handle without being asked and without saying anything about it. I decided that was the kind of person I had been looking for and had not previously found." She paused. "I also decided the drainage problem on the north fence was solvable with the right approach and that I wanted to be the one who solved it." He looked at her. He said, "Bet." She said, "Yes." He said, "There is something in the barn that I made while you were away. While you were managing the property and checking the horse's leg and fixing the gate latch and doing the accounting and writing letters to Dorothy Clausen and apparently solving the drainage problem in your head." He paused. "I made it in the evenings." She looked at him. He said, "Stay here." He got up and went to the barn. He was gone for several minutes. When he came back, he was carrying something small in his hand, which he set on the table in front of her and sat back down. It was a ring. Oak wood cut from a branch that had fallen in the summer storm that had taken a section of the fence in July, which he had picked up from the ground and carried to the workbench, and set there without knowing exactly why. He had worked it in the evenings of the 10 days she was away by lamplight with his father's small chisels that he kept wrapped in oiled cloth. The surface was smooth from long sanding, the grain of the wood visible in the light, a pale curve of it running through the ring that spoke of the particular tree it had come from and the particular work that had been done to make it this. It was too small. He had measured his own finger instead of hers because measuring his own finger was possible, and measuring hers would have required an explanation he had not been ready to give, and his fingers and hers were not the same size, and he had known when he made it that it was too small. She picked it up. She held it between 2 fingers in the lamplight and turned it slowly, examining the grain. the way she examined things she wanted to understand from every angle, looking for what the surface concealed and what it revealed. She said, "You made this." He said, "Yes." She said, "While I was here alone managing the property." He said, "Yes." She said, "You measured wrong." He said, "I measured what I had available." She looked at him over the ring. Her expression had changed in a way he had not seen before, a lowering of whatever it was she held at the surface of herself when she was in the world, some control releasing something underneath it, becoming visible that he thought had always been there, and had always been what she was actually made of underneath the directness and the capability and the steadiness. She said, "Do you know what it tells me that you made this before you asked me anything?" He said, "What does it tell you?" She said, "It tells me that you take things seriously when they matter to you, not carefully. Seriously, there is a difference. Careful is about protecting yourself. Serious is about the thing itself." He said, "Yes. That is the difference." She set the ring on the table between them. She said, "Ask me." Not because of the arrangement, not because of the legal situation, not because I am already here and it would be inconvenient for me to leave. Ask me because you want to ask me. He looked at the ring on the table and then he looked at her. He said, "Bet Pharaoh." He said it plainly without preamble, the way he said everything he meant. He said, "I have been on this land for 9 years. I built what is here with my father's tools and the $400 he left me and 9 years of work that I have not regretted for a day of it. I want to keep building it. I do not want to keep building it alone, not because being alone is beyond me, I have managed it, but because what you have done in 3 weeks alongside me is something I have not had in 9 years, and I know the difference now that I have seen it." He paused. He said, "The ring is too small. I will make it again correctly if you will give me your answer first, so I know what I am making it for." She looked at him for a long time. The fire made its sounds. The wind said what it always said above the north window. Then she reached across the table and picked up the ring and put it on her finger. It stopped at the second knuckle, too small to go further, resting there against the weathered capability of her hand. She said yes. She held up her hand and looked at the ring resting at the knuckle, the small circle of oak in the lamplight, too small and carefully made and honest. She said, "We make it right together. You show me the work. I want to understand it, not just wear the result." He said, "All right." She said, "And I will make one for you. Mine will not be as fine as this one. I am just learning the tools." He said, "It does not need to be fine. It needs to be made." She lowered her hand and looked at the ring a moment longer. Then she took it off and set it in the center of his palm and closed his fingers around it. She said, "Hold on to this one while we make the new ones. It should not be lost." He said, "It will not be." Outside, the Montana night lay over Harrow Valley the way it always did, deep and without opinion. The creek moved in the dark beyond the tree line. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Bet cleared the cups from the table. He stood and helped her. When the table was clear, she took her coat from the hook by the door. She said, "The gate latch. Left side." He said, "I know which side." She went out. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he went to the barn, opened the cloth that held his father's chisels, and picked up the piece of oak he had been saving since July. Enough wood in it for 2 rings if the measurements were right this time. He sat down at the workbench and began. Through the barn wall he heard the gate latch click, then her boots on the porch steps, then the cabin door closing. He worked until the shape of the first ring was roughed out. Then he put the chisel down, looked at what he had started, and went to bed. The hearing in Kearney County took place 6 weeks later. Silas Pharaoh's lawyer withdrew the competence argument 2 days before the date, having received both sworn statements and LeMay's response brief, and having concluded, as LeMay had predicted, that going before a judge with what he had was not in his client's interest. The land passed to Beatrice Pharaoh Danner, as Martin Pharaoh had intended. She sold it in the spring, and the money went into drainage work on the north fence line and 3 breeding cows and a new damper plate for the kitchen stove. Cornelius Pacht contacted LeMay the week after Grove's visit, and the note was properly released through the county office with documentation that LeMay filed and Maggie Troost witnessed. It was done in the way that things done belatedly are sometimes done, without ceremony, without the full accounting of what the delay had cost, but done. Owen Pacht worked the harvest that year on Danner Fork. He did not explain why he came, and Grove did not ask. He came back the following spring and the spring after that, and eventually he simply worked there, and the explanation became unnecessary. Ruth Pacht came to the wedding in November. She sat in the third pew on the right side and did not speak to her husband about what she had done, and he did not ask, and some things in a life together are held privately by one person, and that is sufficient. The rings were oak, both of them, made from the same branch, finished on the same bench by two pairs of hands, learning the work together in the evenings by lamplight, and the grain of the wood ran through them in the particular way that made each one different from the other, and both of them clearly from the same source. They wore them through everything that came after, and a great deal came after.